So it's my great pleasure to introduce this Sunday morning panel on reimagining socialist constitutionalism with Professor Willy Forbath and Aziz Rana. Willy Forbath teaches constitutional law and legal and constitutional theory at UT Austin School. He is the author of Law and the Shaping of the American Labor Movement, the anti-American Constitution, Reconstructing the Economic Foundation of American Democracy, Michigan, and many articles, book chapters, and essays on legal and constitutional history and theory of comparative constitutional law. He occasionally writes on legal and constitutional issues for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, and other outlets, and has served on the boards of Texas organizations for one of the social movements and advocacy for affordable housing. Aziz Rana teaches at Cornell Law School. His research centers on American constitutional law enforcement, with a particular focus on how shifting notions of race, citizenship, and empire have shaped legal and political identities since their founding. He is the author of The Two Faces of American Freedom and the forthcoming book, The Constitutional Line, Why a Broken Document Was Spared. He has written essays for such venues as N+1, the Law School Review, the Washington Post, Consent, the New Labor Forum, Jacobin, the Guardian, Political Higher Education, the LP Project, among others. He is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, an resident of the Quincy Institute for State Affairs, an editorial member of Consent Magazine, and an editorial board member of Just Security. Please welcome Willy.
So thanks so much to all of you for being here. Thank you to the organizers, Sanjay, for all of your work and for that lovely introduction. What I think I'm going to do is just talk for a minute or two to kind of lay out where we're coming from in terms of this panel, and then turn it over to Willy for a bit before saying some more later, and then we're going to probably have a short back and forth and open it up to all of you for whatever your comments and questions might be. So this is a panel on socialist constitutionalism, reimagining it. And one of the things I think that's exciting about having this conversation is how different this moment feels than just 10 years ago, or really let's say the end of the 20th century, the beginning of this one, especially in constitutional law, but I think more generally in broader conversations about constitutionalism. The idea of even having a panel on socialist constitutionalism would be a kind of contradiction in terms. That the field, and by extension, the broader American conversation, was really encased in a Cold War orthodoxy. And a Cold War orthodoxy that basically said that the only way you can imagine constitutional politics was within the straitjacket of a very specific account of liberal democracy. So almost definitionally, and a lot of this will be familiar, the idea of talking about constitutions and constitutionalism is talking about fundamental law, to use Sam Moyn and Ryan Dorfler's language. The thought that, well, constitutionalism is something that stands above ordinary politics, especially democracy, constrains it to a particular account of rights. And within that frame, socialism was essentially associated with the politics of the Soviet Union and was almost definitionally an attack on the idea of any kind of political constraint. So socialism necessarily means a politics of unchecked political authority. And so having a conversation about socialist constitutionalism doesn't make sense because it violates the basic principles of what we understand the model to be. There's only one model. Now, what's notable about this is that if you just peel back, not even all the layers of the Cold War imagination, just peel back some of them, it becomes pretty clear that socialist politics in the 20th century has actually been pretty essential to the development of a variety of different constitutional projects in the US and elsewhere. Some of the most exciting experiments in constitutionalism, which we're going to hear a little bit about just a bit, whether we're talking about Mexico in 1917 or the Weimar Republic, or indeed the variety of experiments in the early 20th century in the US, were infused with a socialist imagination and a very specific socialist theory of what constitutional politics consisted. And indeed, even in the US, the commitment to civil libertarian rights arguments was directly tied to socialist organizing in the labor context, something that Laura Weinreb and many others have written about as well. And so the exclusion of socialist politics from the conversation about constitutionalism is not just a kind of historical occlusion. It's also very much part of a political project to deny the history of, in fact, what the broader range of constitutional imagination has been. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with Willy talking a bit about how socialists conceived of the constitutional state as a tool for systematic economic transformation, and then we'll kind of go from there.
All right. So I want to re-echo Aziz's thanks to Sanjay, to the other organizers, to you all for coming out such an ungodly early hour on a Sunday. Socialists, it turns out, as Aziz said, had a lot to say about constitutionalism. They engaged in a lot of constitutional politics and constitution making. And I want to use some of that history swiftly to explore what socialism might be, looking back to what socialism meant in its salad days, and what uses of socialism or socialist movement, a socialist take on constitutional politics might have today. So first, some ground clearing. Two basic meanings of socialism, at least in sort of the common currency of the sort of chattering classes. Probably state socialism to mean state ownership of the means of production. The Soviet Union was one version of this, nationalized industries, many parts of the globe a different version. Or social democracy understood as a Northern European style welfare state, public provision of social goods and social insurance. When Bernie Sanders talks about democratic socialism, often that's what he's talking about, taxing the rich in order to pay for healthcare for all and higher education for all, and other universal provision of social goods. But neither of those notions captures the core meaning of socialism in its salad days, not in the US, nor in Europe, and from what little I know, nor in Latin America or elsewhere. In all these places, the core meaning was something like this. It meant socialism meant the extension of democracy and democratic institutions into economic and social life. Right? The idea was that liberal democracy could not deliver the goods on its promises of liberty and equality unless the precepts of democracy and Republican self-rule were extended from the sphere of politics to the sphere of social and economic rights. Like social and economic, and precisely not social and economic rights, the mouse said. And the understanding had deep roots, and if I had rolled enough in time, I'd tell you about it. But for now, the important point is that socialism was about the redistribution of social economic power and authority, and not the simple redistribution of wealth and social good. And extending democracy into the governance and control of workplace and firm, into the governance of economic sectors and regions, the path of economic development, the control of capital at the point of investment, as well as production. Right? The idea was to confront, right, in a project and iterative way, as we often say, but often with violent ruptures of mass disobedience, confront the domination of capitalist and land-owning elites and the domination of capitalism as a system over politics and society in favor of principles of material freedom and equality. And this was obtained with regard to the realm of reproduction as well as production. It was about assailing the gender division of labor as well as the capitalist division of labor. Now, what did all this have to do with constitutional politics? Let me offer a few points and a few places. The points first. One work that constitutionalism did in the socialist project was to lay down frameworks and horizons, somewhat in the way that Asli yesterday at the panel, Ryan and Sam, and their interlocutors at Nico. So Nico, Ryan, and Sam were particularly in respect of Ryan and Sam's They said, well, what about seeing constitutionalism as a framework or horizon on which iterative, right, transformative projects could build over time? So I want to revisit that idea of a framework or horizon. Doesn't achieve anything, but it does, on paper by itself, but it does become the basis in politics for building up, right, socialist democratic institutions. So, right, framework, something like framework statutes, quite open-ended, but one in which, right, those who put them down in the Constitution could make claims, right? Second, right, what Amy Cohen calls prefigurative legality, right? That socialist constitutionalism as a politics unfolded in particular arenas. I'm going to use unions as one example, in order to prefigure larger transformations and how they would be lived as a matter of self-rule. And finally, right, and this is an answer way to the question Amna raised vis-a-vis Nico, Ryan, and Sam. How does all this translate? How does specifically the attack on courts translate into the everyday of social movements? And here, so I want to talk about socialist constitutionalism in the vein of opposition, resistance, justifying mass civil disobedience. Sam somewhat disparagingly said that the only thing useful in constitutional law can do for us is help get our movement people out of jail. But that sort of ignores the other part of going to jail, being attacked as lawbreakers, right, and making meaning out of it. So that one thing socialist constitutionalism was about saying, why are we in jail? We're going to jail for a different understanding of our constituent commitments. So those are the 3 points, the 3 places: Mexico, Weimar, USA. I'm going to be very swift, but Weimar Constitution is seen by comparative constitutionalists often today as a kind of baby version of a mature social economic rights constitution. Why baby? Because it wasn't judicially enforceable. This misses everything that's interesting about the Weimar Constitution in this vein. The social law of the Weimar Constitution was about envisioning and creating frameworks for an interlocking set of structures and powers more than rights. It was about laying down, right, some constitutional basis for insisting that the legislature, honor, and courts and capitalists all honor trade unions, not as creatures of the state. In this respect, somewhat at odds with what Aziz said a moment ago. Actually, they were careful. They knew their votes, the dangers of state-dominated unions, so that the Weimar Constitution designated unions as sort of autonomous private institutions with robust freedom of association that trump property rights. But then workers' councils were creatures of the state, and workers' councils in this broad framework sketch of the Weimar Constitution were meant to progressively authorize and empower workers and consumers in the governance of individual firms, individual sectors, and ultimately regional and national political economy, right? There's much more one could say about this, but the idea was that the Weimar Constitution, like the Mexican Constitution in the same moment, was a product of class compromise between parties, socialist parties and bourgeois liberal parties. And Charles Beard said, you could take a couple of crayons and mark off the socialist and the bourgeois liberal parts of the Weimar Constitution. And Schmidt said there's no result. But in fact, the socialists in many contexts had the upper hand in this kind of accommodating, right, compromise constitution, and they laid down very robust safeguards for the building up of unions and workers' councils. Right? Obviously, it's not what the Weimar Constitution is famous for in general, or this was so famous for opening a door for fucking Hitler. But that doesn't mean that this stuff didn't have any meaning. It wasn't a resource. In the fraught decade between 1919 and the 1930s, that much happened under the Weimar Constitution. It was a resource. I'll say no more about that. And I'll say even less about Mexico because I want to get to the U.S. So Mexico. The Mexican Constitution likewise was the fruit, kind of like Weimar, came on the heels of very violent social conflict, not factory occupations like in Weimar, but Zapatistas, engaged in armed struggle. And the Zapatistas and their comrades in other parts of Mexico famously carried with them the old title deeds to ancient Pueblo land. And these title deeds they saw as kind of marking off their claim to land redistribution, that the haciendas, this large landowners had taken away what was their communal property. And the ejito was an institution inscribed in the Mexican Constitution that came to stand for two very interesting things, both a backward-looking mythic restoration or restitution on one hand, and a forward-looking division of the big landholders' land, in both cases as communal property for, communes of poor peasants, which would be at once divisible into, for the uses of families and households, but inalienable and, and in some portions of it communal for common use. And it was both that and the forward-looking part of the city, that not every sort of landless peasant or peasant community has some ancient claim, get real. We just need to break it up. And so there were sort of the agronomists coming from the center, working with these local units of government to divide up and at the same time hold together land. And the project continued for decades and took on different forms. But again, the idea was this was a framework, and it was very iterative. It involved many different, it was all legislative and administrative. It wasn't judicial. The best thing it did for the courts, in this case, they used the US Constitution, US constitutional experience as a kind of handicap and an antimon. The most important thing was to keep the courts out of it. And the language they crafted in the Constitution helped persuade courts to stay away from this kind of land redistribution, even though, big landowners had culpable claims under other constitutional provisions for the courts to intervene and prevent. The US, right? So I know most about socialist revolutionary constitutionalism on the Lower East Side of New York, where there was a great deal of interesting lawyering. And I want to talk about the ways in which socialists, many of them Bundists from sort of the Russian Jewish Marxists who said Marxism in the Orthodox sense demands this kind of assimilation on the part of Jews and other minorities. You have to renounce your Jewishness or your Lithuanianness or your this or thatness in order to become a true proletariat. That was really disguised Russian chauvinism. You can be a good socialist and a good Jew, and that means a deep pluralism melded with socialism. That's and some savvy about constitution making that they gained as they fought for a sort of a democratic constitution in 2005 that was put down by the Tsar. And the putting down of that revolutionary moment in 2005 sent thousands and thousands of these Bundists, among others, to New York, where they became sort of some of the leading rank and file activists and thinkers behind the creation of the ILGWU. And it's in that context of creating that union that I want to just quickly highlight two different kinds of uses of social constitutionalism and socialist practice and politics. One is in the union itself. The most radical Bundist socialist pluralists actually won the support of hundreds of thousands of rank workers in a contest that was really internal to the union. Who would enjoy authority in this massive collective bargaining agreement to run the entire industry? It was a real experiment in labor corporatism. Everybody in the main conflicts wanted it to work. capital, right, wanted the union to discipline, right, the sweatshops and the small shops. And so capital people like Filey sent Brandeis, right, and said, get these, Jews to work together to create a framework in which to stop all these wildcat strikes and this ruinous competition and the embarrassment of selling sweated labor's goods. And so, right, the ILG national leadership and characters like Brandeis worked well together, but the rank and file grew restive because the scheme Brandeis had created, right, was very top-down form of arbitration, rarely arbitrated, mostly mediated and mostly labor laws. And so a rank and file revolt emerged. The Socialist Bundists led the rank and file revolt. They said, we need to run our union, right? They used the trope of the sort of militias and the rank and file of the American Revolution and the kind of constitutionalism they envisioned, which, right, Pache Samuel, who's not here, was radically democratic and constitutionalist all the way back in the 18th century, which they fully understood. And they brought those tropes to bear on the constitution of this union. This union should be run by the rank and file. The rank and file, and not the national leaders, should enjoy authority to interpret and apply and conciliate and ultimately arbitrate disputes. All through the trope of we're creating a constitution here in this union and finding out how it works as a way of prefiguring a socialist, democratic, socialist America. And by the way, we have, right, Yiddish locals and Italian-speaking locals with African Americans as they entered the union. There were sort of debates and contestation over should there be Black locals or should there be integrated locals, and the integration is one. But the important thing was we're about social unionism with rich educational projects. And in that space, we're about Black history and Jewish history and Italian history. We're about sort of melding class politics with multiculturalism. Finally, they were building a corporatist project and a union for the entire industry, which demanded a closed shop, which was flatly illegal. When the sort of Employers Association grew impatient with the, with the project and the union, they went to court. They got an injunction. It was illegal to strike for a big closed shop. And in the courthouse, right, Meyer London argues, not designed to persuade the court, the court's law is counterfeit. I am confident that when the strike is enjoined, you will throw 50 or 60 of our leaders in jail and 50 or 60 more will rise up. Right? Because we stand for the constitutional rights of these workers, which are collective rights, right? Which safeguard, right, our freedom to sort of quit work together and assemble and unite and cure the industry of sweatshops, but also, right, vindicate our constitutional rights. It was almost as old as the Constitution itself to make those kinds of anti-judicial supremacy claims. So the answer, one part to what Amna asked about how does this come back to social movement politics, it comes back when you're defining the courts. And it's not just lawyers making smart arguments about why we can go to jail, it's why we are going to jail. And we're going to jail in this account to redeem our version of the American project. So that's one more use of constitutionalism and socialist movement. I'm sorry, go on.
So I think kind of picking up from that, what I'm going to spend maybe the next 10 to 15 minutes doing is talking a bit about how within the US, this early 20th century American socialist tradition, what it sort of suggests about the really kind of deep problems of confronting profound institutional injustice in society, and where does constitutional change fit within the project of transforming a deeply oppressive political present into something like this sort of imagined possibilities of democratic experimentalism in economics and politics for the future. And I'm going to focus on three different points. So the first is that early 20th century socialists, and I think this is actually pretty consistent of socialist politics as the 20th century progresses, had a specific and sustained critique of mainstream progressivism and the kinds of reformist horizon that mainstream progressives imagine, with lots of resonances, I think, for the present. And then I want to spend a little bit of time with two really profound tensions within the politics of change that continue to basically shape our own questions today, and end with just like a couple of quick reflections more directly on the present. So the thing that socialists shared with mainstream progressives in the early 20th century was a basic sense that the society was inadequately addressing the needs of the majority of its citizens, and that the constitutional order was a major roadblock. So it had become basically a truism by the time you get to the 1900s and the teens, that the Constitution was anti-democratic, it was riddled with all of these veto points. Honestly, I don't even need to rehearse it in this audience because it's a truism today. It's not even a radical position to say that the Constitution is undemocratic. You can read it in the editorial page of the New York Times. And so, in a way, what socialists were trying to navigate was, if this basic critique and actually think of it as a mechanism for genuinely transforming the society. And to put a kind of overarching frame on it, the socialist position, in contrast to progressives 100 years ago, and indeed you can think of this as in contrast to liberals today, was that the path of constitutional redemption is a failed path. That you have to confront an effort to imagine change through redeeming the Constitution and the existing infrastructure, the existing landscape of institutions, with a politics of constitutional rupture. And they made both kind of institutional arguments for why this was the case, as well as kind of cultural arguments. So the institutional argument was that all of these efforts to redeem the Constitution, at the end of the day, imagined you could get to some point where you could separate substance and process. In other words, it might be the case that the rules basically are aligned with the interests of the few, those that are wealthy, corporations, etc. But if you get the right judges on the court, or if you have the right kind of presidential leadership, or if you make certain types of minor changes around the edges, like get rid of the electoral college and have direct election of the Senate, then somehow the rules would no longer be rigged, and that you could actually have the change that you want. And the argument that the socialists pretty consistently made was that no, this misunderstands in a deep sense the relationship between the state institutions and the underlying society. That under capitalist relations, society was organized around a fundamental contradiction between the interests of the few and the interests of the many, and that the institutions were an expression of this underlying contradiction, and they were systematically rigged in ways that suggested that they were far more hardwired to produce outcomes that were pathological than the progressives imagined. And then the second point was that this also then misunderstood the nature of what constitutional politics should be. It still imagined that you could get to some external place where if you had the right kind of lawyers and technocratic experts that just sort of imagined the right institution, if maybe they got together in particular venues, they came up with some new document, then all would be well. But this was just reimposing some new fundamental law on the society. And that the best way to think about constitutionalism was as constitutional politics, as a sustained experiment, as Willy was articulating, in democratic experimentation. In other words, the point was to empower the working class as an organized base that was capable of asserting its interests, both in politics and economics, and continually revising the underlying institutions of society, including the political institutions, to produce outcomes that were consistent with its own ends. In other words, this is stuff that Alma writes about and Jocelyn, that this was a commitment to a vision of power building where what you're looking for is creating something like a sovereign constituent power within a popular, mobilized working class majority that thinks of itself as class conscious, that's able to exercise authority, and that's implementing reforms that are revolutionary reforms that shift the institutional landscape, that make the existing status quo harder to replicate. And they said that the Constitution, as it existed, undermined this project, not just in its institutional forms and its process, but also because of the cultural role that it played in society. That in Europe, the interests of a feudal order were sustained through the symbols of the church and of the crown. But in the US, it was the very symbols of republicanism, and chief among them the Constitution, that sustained the old order, precisely because it was an infrastructure to replicate and entrench minority rule, yet it was framed through a language of we the people, that in its cultural form said, hey, you're already free, you're already a sovereign self-governing republic, when in reality, all of this was doing was sustaining practices of class and elite deference, and that had to be broken. So constitutional politics was both a vision of continuous democratic experimentation, but also a practice on the ground of breaking elite forms of deference through power building. And that was the primary impulse behind a variety of the forms that they conceived of. What are the two problems that I think are still really relevant for the present? Problem number one is that socialists, and here I'm going to include like anarchists and folks in IWW, struggled with the issue about what to make of the fact that the processes that were established, if you just were to win elections, were really sort of huge roadblocks in terms of producing even minor change, let alone the kind of change that you imagine. That in order to create dramatic alterations in the society, most likely, you're going to have to break from the processes established by the electoral and legal institutions of the state. And indeed, if you just look at the move from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, violated the Articles of Confederation. If you look at the Reconstruction Amendments, they were pursued in ways that were not consistent with the actually established process because the process inhibited us. The SPA, the Socialist Party position, was to believe that it represented a majority and that it could bring to bear through elections enough votes and support to overcome even these procedural roadblocks. And indeed, when confronted with the question about, well, what if that doesn't happen? What if you have to actually engage in norm breaking? The primary response, and in some ways, the lawyers that Willy is talking about participated in this, was to try to obscure the question. They were accused of being lawless, so rather than seeming to be lawless, they sort of said, well, we don't have to worry about that because the truth of the matter is the working class will follow what we say and we'll be able to succeed through elections in ways that are consistent with established constitutional process and rights. The IWW and various radical labor activists at the time said, well, this is not an answer. And precisely because this is not an answer, it might be the case that there will need to be non-procedural mechanisms, and in particular, mass general strikes as a way of actually claiming control over the operation of the industrial economy. And another reason why they said this was important is because many of the people they sought to organize didn't even have the vote, beyond the fact that you have, women, Black people, children who were a significant part of the labor, like the laboring economy, didn't have the right to vote. So they're like, well, we're gonna have to use these other means. But of course, the problem with the call to the general strike was that that it had its own kind of wish fulfillment element that paralleled the idea that elections alone and abiding by process will get you what you want. That there's a kind of millennial aspiration that there'll be some shock to the system and the society will change. What both effectively avoided at that moment in time, and what has continued to be a problem for socialist political thinking, was how to develop a responsible ethics of what amounts to revolutionary politics. That the Socialist Constitutional Project will require some norm breaking, but it has to be norm breaking on behalf of deepening democracy. And this is a kind of revolutionary practice but it's a revolutionary practice that has to be thought through so that you have an assessment of when and under what circumstances to pursue the kind of ruptural change that might be needed, because you can't assume that Article 5 conventions of the process established by the federal constitution offers any kind of meaningful pathway. And then there's a second problem. And the second problem was the overarching question of race and colonialism, which I think also still is a major issue for contemporary American socialist politics. So many of the early 20th century white socialists that I venerate as, you know, real American heroes like Debs were absolutely committed to political equality on racial and gender grounds. And they recognized the way in which their own efforts were a continuation of the abolitionist imagination. But the overarching position was one that viewed class basically as a kind of fundamental category. And so even the analysis, for instance, of slavery was what slavery embodied was a kind of extreme version of class rule. And so that the critique of society and the analysis of the Constitution was grounded in the thought of overcoming forms of class domination. Now, the rubber meets the road problem was that members of local unions, of socialist chapters in various parts of the country were committed to racial discrimination and to exclusion. And so what do you do when significant segments of your own base have no interest in a project of racial transformation? And over time, the socialist position, and there were socialists that were straight up white supremacists, but let's say the socialist position among people like Debs was that, well, you have to kind of meet the people where they are. You press for the economic changes, and if you have certain kinds of economic transformations in the society, then you'll end up having racial transformations. This was frankly, also the politics of the progressive period and the New Deal. And this approach failed. It failed systematically in the context of labor organizing, the socialist movement, and it failed in the context of the New Deal story. It's the story of New Deal's ultimate defeat when confronted by the entrenchment of Jim Crow. And you had Black socialists at the time, so that there's a concurrent tradition that runs through this entire period that said, unless you put the question of race front and center and understand American capitalism as a project of racial capitalism, you will never get either the organizing changes you want or the institutional changes. And the reason why was that the most extreme forms of minority rule in the country at the time, the most extreme embodiments of the very problems with the anti-democratic features of the constitutional system were modes of white authoritarianism through the state system that systematically disenfranchised Black people in the South and that were a product of the underlying nature of the society. The society wasn't just marked by class rule, but it was an experiment. This is my own language, but it's a variation of language that you have a wide range of Black activists saying. It was an experiment in settler colonialism that expropriated indigenous land and then used enslaved Black labor to work that land, and then created an infrastructure of political institutions to sustain those dynamics. And unless you had that analysis, as well as an account of how that then produced not just authoritarianism, but white authoritarianism and despotic rule, you didn't have a way of actually organizing the working class or conceiving of what the appropriate changes to the institutions should be. And it's why throughout the 20th century, there was a continual undercurrent of Black constitutional argument that is almost never even viewed as constitutional argument. And this is, take something like Harry Haywood, the Black communist Black Belt thesis. So the Black Belt thesis is oftentimes thought of from the 20s, 30s as, this is this absurd notion among communists about a separate Black state in the South. That was not Haywood's argument. Haywood's argument was that the states and state-based representation systematically disenfranchised Black people and facilitated then the denial of Black voting power. And that you couldn't actually get democracy in the US, just majority rule, unless you fundamentally transformed that state infrastructure. And so he called for a breaking up of the states and a reorganization of the administrative framework across the South, from Virginia to Texas, so as to actually create political units that could express a Black majority. And that's an argument that you see Du Bois making in the 40s, in the 30s and 40s. That's an argument that James Boggs in Drum makes in the 1960s in a tremendous essay called The City is the Black Man's Land, where he takes that idea about the agricultural base of Black life in the 20s, and he updates it to the northern cities in the 1960s and says that you need a similar breaking up of the states and reimagination of the basic political units in order to actually overcome the conditions both of racial capitalism as well as the constitutional system that sustains it. And it's the foundation of the Black Panthers Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention in 1970. Now, today, these two problems about how to get from here to there remain, in my view, the central problems of American life generally and of the American left specifically. Problem number one is confronting the fact forthrightly that the change that I would want cannot occur, not just under this Constitution, but under the procedural arrangements established by the Constitution. And so that requires not just saying, hey, it's undemocratic, we should get rid of the Electoral College. It requires a politics that understands that you need to engage in systematic mass mobilizing. You have to build a revolutionary base and then have an ethic, a responsible ethic of how to use such revolutionary power. And then the second is not just going back and forth in theoretical terms about, is it class first, is it race first, but actually developing a synthetic account of the relationship between race, colonialism, and capitalism, and then working through what that actually means for a transformative politics that is multiracial and class conscious, but that understands the problem of the Constitution as embedded in these deep structures. Now, with this second point, I think the deep problem for the present is the same problem that Black socialists face, which is they had no majority in a majority white society. How do you actually make this kind of an analysis, not a racially liberal one, but a racially socialist and radical one, in a society that is committed to its own heroic narratives of past, that is suspicious of arguments about fundamental structural change, and that is, embedded in what amounts to a minority within a majority society? Like, how do you convince a majority effectively to give up some element of its own authority as a condition of transforming the society writ large? All right, so I think with that, I was going to ask Willy a question, and then maybe we'll open it up. That both of us, in a way, have been talking about the relationship of constitutional politics to history and memory. So we've provided a kind of an account of the 20th century. And this, of course, raises an issue, which is it makes sense for conservatives to invoke history and memory. There's a reason why conservatives like originalism. You want to go back to the past because you can use the injustice of the past as a way of warding off against change in the present. But what does it mean to have a politics committed to radical rupture and radical transformation, and yet grounded in history and memory? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think even Debs, as much as in Aziz's wonderful language, he sought to disenthrall the American working class and the international working class, so specifically the U.S. working class, from constitutional veneration, from constitutional worship, and to champion dramatic changes in the hardwired Constitution. So much of his arguments, speech making, nonetheless was making claims on the past. That he made a move that Frederick Douglass, but also Abe Lincoln made before him, of saying the Declaration is the starting point. And Lincoln would say, you know, the Constitution was made like a frame for the golden apple of the Declaration, and Douglas too traded in a certain kind of redemptive politics, not of the Constitution frame, not of the framers by and large, but nonetheless saying there is simply too much afoot in a culture in which we move and have to build a mass movement that rides on a common identity rooted in the past. When people, you're making appeals, if you're not going to appeal simply to the solidarity of the workers of the world, but to some other political identities and shared identities on which to build a movement, you're making claims on some common past. And in this country, inescapably so, I think Deb saw, he needed to sort of reclaim the Declaration and its authors and the project they embarked on as a matter of shared memory, shared myth, shared memory, shared identity, and to do so in a way that nevertheless made it vividly clear that you needed to blow up much of the Constitution framework, you know, and keep it in, you know, in a more plastic way. It's why it's so important for all the socialists and social democrats was to make the Constitution more cheap. And that's part of what making it more a democratic experiment was about. It's so interesting. You know, I was talking yesterday as a student who's found in a number of state constitutional conventions that when the CIO socialists would go to a convention, the most important thing was to make whatever constitution was on the table more changeable. But that's not the same as relinquishing under the Constitution.
So I'm gonna surface this as a potential tension, which is, for me, I tend to be wary or suspicious of common national narratives. And some of that comes out of my own politics, which is just kind of grounded in internationalism that tends to view common national narratives as oftentimes undermining a forthright recognition of the fact that there are conflicting interests between those that are oppressed and those that are not oppressed within the society. And so, though I think you're absolutely right in the way that you're describing, Debs, that there is still clear redemptive strains. It might not be redemption of the Constitution, but maybe it's redemption of a particular vision of anti-slavery or abolitionist possibility. The invocations of history and memory that I'm most interested in are the ones that allow us to basically break free from the vice grip that's been imposed by the broader Cold War. In other words, part of the reason why I began with stating that my education, certainly in the US, presumed that constitutionalism and socialism was an inevitable contradiction is a function of an incredibly narrow political horizon that was imposed, and it was imposed in part through the reading out of our shared historical memory of, in my view, all of the figures, literally all of the figures that actually have something to offer us in the present. So that if we're in a present that basically is the end of a specific kind of constitutionally redemptive imagination, and we're seeing that over the last 50 years, it's basically collapsed. Rather than going back to all of those same people again and thinking that if we have those as our intellectual influences, if we just run it back, there'll be a different outcome. It's essential to go to all of the folks that they themselves, even if at times they were allies with them, systematically excluded from our contemporary narrative. So if you're interested in the story of the ACLU, rather than going back to Roger Baldwin, go to Crystal Eastman. If you're interested in the ERA, rather than going to Alice Cole, Crystal Eastman, if you're interested in the potential for transformative racial change, rather than going to Ralph Bunche and Thurgood Marshall, go to Du Bois, and even beyond Du Bois to folks like James Fox. And that's an essential component for left thinking now. But I also think, at least for me, there's a kind of psychic loneliness to being a left person in the world in which you have no heroes or intellectual inspirations, when your intellectual horizon starts basically exclusively in the present. And so the invocation of history is a way of highlighting the persistence of these traditions as American traditions, not in the sense that they were American patriots. Many of them were anti-nationalists, but in the sense that there's like a depth to these ideas that we're a part of that goes back, centuries.
Well, I give you one question, then we throw it up. And I'm torn. So I'm gonna put two on the table and you choose one to come back to. One is, I think you're absolutely right. We need to think hard about. Let's put it on the table, illegality. I mean, that's the, when you talk about a responsible revolutionary ethics, that's what you. How does one sort of, what are the preconditions for rupture? If serious constitutional structural change is if the past is a prologue, willy-nilly entangled with ruptures and owning politics of rupture. And I think you and I agree that strong majority, I think in one of our conversations in the past, you talked about majorities first. And I think that's right, but I think that it will be fruitful over time. In some ways, mainstream liberals have, more developed ideas about rupture and illegality, or, that people like Ackerman and Omar have something to say about rupture and illegality. We need to think harder about it in responsible ways of evoking it. And so I will invite you and all of us to talk about that if it's of interest. And then the other thing is reaching back to internationalists, which is and finding allies today across national boundaries is obviously part of a sensible left project. But how does constitutionalism fit with the internationalists? I mean, constitutions are national projects. And I dare say Du Bois, now I don't know enough about Du Bois to know how he mediated between the sort of his account of a kind of an abolitionist constitutionalism for his day and his emergent internationalists. But there does seem to be some tension.
Yeah, so I'll try to be very quick, and then curious your thoughts, and then we go to what folks want to talk about. On the rupture point, I think this is a really important one. I mean, if we move outside of the US context, then the inevitability of not following the procedures of the past unjust system are pretty straightforward. I mean, you wouldn't expect, and indeed, this has been the story, like whatever you might think about what ultimately happened with the Chilean constitutional exercise, Chile is not going to be like, what we should do? We should just abide. We should, systematically abide by whatever Pinochet came up with as the arrangements that we're going to follow and how we establish a new society. It makes no sense. But that, of course, raises a basic question, which I think is something that liberals and even folks on the left have wanted to suppress. In other words, if you actually want a new convention or really dramatic constitutional rewriting in the US, it has to be connected to a kind of revolutionary moment. And that means that you have to build a base that's capable of authorizing as legitimate that change. So again, in Chile, it wasn't that 10 years ago, people started by saying, well, there are problems with our constitutional system, we should have a convention. It was that you had the sustained mobilization and building of a labor movement that then spread as mass protest. And indeed, it means that in some ways, I think the kind of now contemporary response to the anti-democratic problems of the constitutional system get it exactly backwards, which is like leading with, we need to have, I think we should have an analysis of what's wrong with the Senate or, voting rights. These are all very, very important things. But the frame has to be, well, how do you actually build a transformative majority that could then authorize the more radical ruptures and breaks? And that might mean that things like strengthening the bargaining position of labor is as important a kind of an act of constitutional politics as calling for getting rid of the electoral college or simplifying the amendment process, which is something that I'm very committed to. So in other words, that to me, a responsible ethics has to begin by having an assessment of, well, what power do you actually wield in society? And what's the capacity of your organized base to be able to authorize as a practical matter the change that you want? And then on the internationalism thing, I think this is like in some ways the really deep tension. And this was the IWW critique of the SPA over time, which is all of these socialists paid lip service, more or less, to the fact that they were internationalists. Their primary identification was with the working class. And because their primary identification was the working class, they said over and over again that the people that were really, engaged in oppression for workers at home were co-nationals. And so that nationalism was a way to just occlude that reality. But if you start step by step going down the path of, well, the main approach is going to be elections, trying to win elections, get a majority in both houses, move toward constitutional change that's like intermediary, then inevitably you're going to start thinking not just about, well, where are people when it comes to their racial prejudices, but like, where is this white majority when it comes to their sense of like civic identity? And almost inevitably that turns into a politics of nationalism. And there are big reasons why we associate constitutions with nations, like the story of the spread of the Constitution globally is really a story of the emergence of the nation state and the collapse of the old imperial order. And it's a way both for domestic audiences and international audiences, for national elites to assert their own legitimacy. So there's a big reason why it's associated. And then also just like culturally within sort of just the interstices of the society, constitutions become one of the ways of talking about national symbols and national identity. That to me is a kind of unavoidable tension. I don't think that there's a resolution to it, but it requires keeping it in tension. And my view was that some of the folks in the SPA and some of the people that became part of the New Deal fell too decisively on one side of it. Rather than maintaining that tension and understanding that domestic electoral strategies are essential, they're important, but there are these features of it that you have to also navigate, and you have to figure out ways to combine the electoral and the non-electoral, sort of just like falling into a belief that, the Declaration is great, there are these inalienable rights, we live in this democracy, that's the language that people want, what we're doing is just restoration. And that can be a comfortable frame, and it's a frame that I think, has produced real change, but has its own very clear limitations. So why don't we open it up? Go ahead.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what this point of rupture ought to look like as a practical matter. I think it is truly important to understand the Constitution itself as it exists. It was born out of a point of rupture and how part of the foundation had a process for amendment that the founders threw into the trash can. Right? If you believe in national narratives, I think there's a prerogative contained in that. At the same time, though, for me, thinking about how to succeed is a practical matter. I don't think that you need a real durable popular majority, like 60–70% of the public to back constitutional change, or for it to really take. When I say that to people, sometimes the pushback I get is, well, you can do it with less, you just have to break up the United States. But I think that's like a real question. What is the appropriate threshold we should be aiming for in order to pursue that point of rupture And what does it actually look like in the end? The idea of the national force is like very mainstream now, actually. But I think that's the short part, important, right? Like it's taking the easy way out. Like people who would be left behind by that kind of outcome are not people who want to leave behind. If we move to the new revolution, we would leave a lot of poor people back beholden to parts that would not, parts of the country that would not enter into the new compact. Right? So if we want to instead push about 60 or 70%, how do we build that kind of a real consensual supermajority? And then what is the actual mechanism for change whenever that comes back? If it's not like an Article 5 convention or something.
Should I start?
Sure.
So to me, when I mean the socialists in here, you know, talking about lots of different groups, early 20th century, but also later on, we're talking about rupture versus redemption. I'm thinking of it in two different ways. So one is as a kind of intellectual and political matter, which is having a horizon that's not about alterations to this existing system can somehow redeem a promise that's always been present from the founding, but rather that we have as our horizon a fundamentally new and transformed society that has an institutional landscape that is very different than our own. And that's a way of being committed to change that's like a backdrop. And I think that that's actually really important because then that provides a way of assessing politics in the present. So a lot of the socialists from folks like Debs and Eastman to people like Norman Thomas and Vito Marcantonio in the 30s, like they were open to a convention. A convention call was a pretty classic part of socialist political platforms, but they were very hesitant to put all the eggs in the convention basket because of the fact that the society itself was still pretty fundamentally unjust. Like if the underlying social order is unjust and you have a convention, what are you going to get out of the convention? You're going to get a replication of that society. Or today, who is it that wants a convention in the United States? The Convention of States call is coming from the right because they see the tools embedded in the existing system as ones that can be manipulated to make even worse the constitutional order. And so a lot of what they were imagining was a kind of continuous iterative relationship, as Willy was discussing, between pressing for the kind of non-reformist reforms that Jocelyn, Amna, and others have discussed. So, okay, like you want, let's see if we can get a simplified amendment process. Let's see if we can actually expand the voting base. Like, let's see if we can do all of these things that alter the procedural landscape. And the reason why they're valuable is they expand the actual power. They're power building exercises for the working class. And they make it more likely that they can win in future struggles. And then alongside that, you press for changes like the 8-hour day or collective bargaining or strengths for labor, which again are power building exercises. And then the thought is that this intermediary process can generate the conditions for like something that exists in the horizon. You know, I think you can see potential parallels to the present in being able to hold these two things constant. And then I also think that on this question about like when will norm breaking produce democracy reinforcing results as opposed to democracy undermining results? That's a function of actual political strategy. That's sort of the question. It's like, would getting rid of the filibuster to pass voting rights, that's a kind of minor form of norm breaking. Will that produce democracy enhancing results? I think so. Will putting 2 more justices on the Supreme Court? I personally think that it's not entirely clear. That might generate certain kinds of tit for tat and then the right sort of expand the court. But maybe more comprehensive judicial reforms that violate certain types of presumptions about lifetime tenure, those actually would be democracy enhancing. But that's a kind of level of analysis that's a different kind of discussion than folks, I think, in liberal circles and on the left have oftentimes been comfortable having.
Yeah, I agree with all that Aziz said. I think that including what he said earlier on, which is at at this point, it's probably more important to put on the table and find space in the political conversation for more dramatic kinds of social and economic reform. To build the kind of majority, they have to be reforms that themselves are empowering, but also that are riveting for people, so that the conversation yesterday about sort of labor law reform, which juxtaposed, sort of clean slate ideas of let's imagine a labor law reform that would make for sectoral margin. Alongside Ron's, let's imagine a United States, a society with universal job guarantees. And Raul pointed out that latter idea, which involves macroeconomic change, is as sort of Ron was putting on the table, actually sort of rally support from is there in the Black Lives Matter programmatic statements, is there in the sort of small independent unions of people of color and sort of underemployed people, that it's and whatever is already movement building around wages for housework or various ways of remunerating care work. So I think putting on the table a plethora of ambitious sort of ruptures with the existing frameworks of social and economic arrangements, and seeing whether they rally a large majority, is as important in order of business as sort of figuring out just the right court reform. And it probably has to precede the project of say how, just exactly what mechanism of rupture, right? The small, the sort of making new states, sort of breaking the idea, and openly saying, as Republicans did a century ago, we're going to create some new states to build our strength. In their case, it was building the strength of a party that had abandoned Reconstruction. In our case, it would be building the strength of a Democratic Party that just may become a vehicle for transformative changes. But either way, it's sort of small and medium scale changes, both on the substance of what the project is, if you're going to build this majority, and prefiguring institutional changes through creating more states and other work.
I'm curious, before we go, what you think of the invocation of secession, because it is true. One of the things that's interesting is this idea of percolating in the background, that there are these red states and blue states, and maybe that there needs to be a national divorce. You hear it from obviously like the right, but then there's a way in which I think it's present in liberal culture. My own view about it is from left and liberal voices. I see it as, in this moment, an act of real political pessimism. And it's an act of political pessimism precisely because of the sense that, that there's this gulf between the present and the future. And there's a wariness of actually thinking about, well, what would it mean to invest in the power building practices of organizing the majority? That seems impossible. And one response to it is, well, if that kind of power building exercise is impossible, then the country as it currently exists is sort of in a permanent fixture, and there's no actual
I live in Texas. What do you think? I think it's a kind of class snobbery. Blue state secessionism. We've got a struggle on our hands, and I also completely agree that the upshot is to leave the most vulnerable Americans exposed to sort of even worse kinds of proto-fascist regimes.
So I feel like there are a bunch of hands, and we're going to when? 10:40? 10:40. Okay, so why don't we just collect some questions? Maybe let's do, oh my gosh. I feel like a round of three. So I'm just gonna go with the first three that I saw. I saw I'm sorry, your name?
Yeah.
Yash. I saw Yash, I saw Tina and Jocelyn, and then we'll do 3 more. Is that okay? And honestly, we've sucked up a lot of air, so, okay, go
I
ahead.
just want to make a brief comment. First of all, thank you for doing this. I've learned a lot. This might be somewhat unpopular to say, but I think I grew up with a lot of working class people and immigrant communities. I don't want to underestimate the importance of the American creed, that most people still do embrace it to a certain extent, that perhaps in this room that they don't, that I think that there may be some benefit to perhaps talking about how exceptional the Constitution was, perhaps not just in the text. I know it's flawed. We can look at how pro-slavery it was, or talk about how so many people couldn't vote, but we don't talk about how New York actually had free Black people vote. We can talk about so many other special things about the Constitution, because I think that so many working people, we might underestimate how much they embrace it. That maybe by going so against it in terms of rupturing completely, we might alienate a lot of people who would be with the kind of change that we want to do. I think that's something. Yeah.
Thanks. I want to press a little bit Will's point about internationalism and the pressure it puts on the constitutionalist commitment, in the sense that many of the folks you mentioned, including the Black Panthers, right, at some point they pivot from civil rights to human rights, and by human rights they don't mean liberal stuff, they mean internationalist stuff, right? Or Du Bois, William Patterson sends him to New York to go over Eleanor Roosevelt's head, and basically say the entirety of the US government is committing genocide against Black people. And that, in a sense, was also for much of the 20th century the dividing line amongst between like the most radical parts or especially Black radicalism and the more moderate parts, right? So like the pressure it puts to still thinking about constitutionalism as the center of that sort of politics.
And
Awesome.
Great, hi. So I wanted to maybe ask a kind of meta question about where this thinking and our thinking, or even just being here at this conference, fits into our ability to support, be a part of the kind of constitutional imagining and radical imagining that I think all of these visions want and need. And I think about it in a bunch of ways. One is just sort of like, what's the relationship between our conversations now about getting inspiration from this radical history and like, you know, the zines and teachings that movements are generating now, which are similarly getting inspiration from abolitionist history and often in conversation with each other. Where in some of those rooms, we had a wonderful panel of organizers here yesterday. But then, and so that's sort of just one, like how do those conversations happen? And then also just sort of thinking about the role of, I mean, we haven't heard that much about lawyers in these stories, but I know they're in there, like that the lawyers are doing what we're doing. And I say we, you know, there's lots of different people in this room and lots of different roles. But yeah, I would just love to hear how you're thinking about the relationship, even just between your thinking or just even more broadly the conversation.
should we take a moment and then go back to get another round, or what do you think? You want to start?
Some of them just seem to me very rich, important interventions and contributions that, like Jocelyn's, we're all doing stuff that may, you know, I think everyone in this room in dozens of different ways tries to be, you know, those of us who are academics try to have a foot elsewhere, and those of us who are not engage, try also, you know, when it's useful to engage with academics. So I teach high school teachers. I support high school. In Texas, it's all the more urgent to be involved with teachers who are even, you know, who are as vulnerable as some of us may be in the university over the next decade. You know, even more so, high school teachers are vulnerable. So I, you know, try to do some of that. And for times, I don't think I have anything that's all that surprising or original. I do a bunch of stuff. And I know you do too. So,
I just wanted to ask, like,
Yeah.
not what do you do, but like,
So,
what do we do?
so one thing that I will say, and I guess we're being live streamed, so be it. I'll just be blunt about it, which is my basic view is that elite American legal institutions have been a massive roadblock. And that they've been a massive roadblock, not just in the, building schools like the law and economics that sort of provide the intellectual foundations for neoliberalism, but also from supposed or perceived allies in essentially treating movement ideas and arguments that emerge from communities that are actually marginalized as not on their face serious political or constitutional claims that have to be translated into a legal language that is basically the language of reform that in the US has been judge managed and so limited by what essentially elites within the state and within the academy understand to be legitimate political claims. And to me, if we're thinking about politics rather than organizing at law schools, the benefit of something like LTE in a conference like this is actually thinking about, well, what has been the function of even the reformist branch of the American Legal Academy, and to what extent can it be reoriented so that at the very least, it's not a direct roadblock, that it's actually thinking alongside movements in a way that's organic rather than essentially top down. And that is a significant hurdle, even within my own thinking, because of frankly, the nature of being acculturated to these institutions. Quickly on the creed, this is a much longer conversation, and I think this is certainly right. Like my own politics is a deep suspicion of even left kind of creedal arguments. But at the same time, I think there has to be a recognition of its elasticity. The fact that even some of the people that I think of as heroes, like Paul Robeson was a creedalist. He believed in the Declaration of Independence. He wrote his undergraduate thesis on the sleeping giant of the sleeping giant of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, and imagined that you could combine a type of creedal constitutionalism with, basically global international socialism. Now, I think that there are perhaps real limitations to it, but I think you can't ignore that these are powerful narratives that shape where people are. And for me, that's part of what, Willy mentioned, this idea of movement first. Rather than having fights on the left over kind of sectarian purity about first principles, it's really important to think of this as like coalitions of constituencies that might have very different first principles that are committed in some deep sense to a transformative project. And then on the internationalism point, I think that this is a key thing, which is that it seems to us conceptually impossible to have a constitutional politics without being a nationalist, without actually being embedded in a we the people enterprise. But there's a long history of folks, especially but not exclusively within Black and Indigenous spaces, that very much rejected that and had an international politics. Now, and that meant imagining international venues as ways to alter the domestic. But to the extent that I want to say that they were also constitutionalists rather than just critics of constitutionalism, what I don't mean is that they believe that if you got the right text domestically, problems would be solved, but that they saw constitutional politics as one of the sites of political struggle. And so we're invested in what it would mean domestically to take seriously that as a site of struggle alongside their international engagements. So do you want to?
These are the sort of socialist lawyers that I'm talking about, both apropos Justice's question, were enmeshed in doing the work of enabling the rank and file to advocate on their own behalf in the kinds of creating arenas that made that possible. So sort of and we're also committed internationalists, which and I think in some ways we're pretty self-conscious about saying we're in but not of this kind of national constitutional project. That we're doing this in order to create, because the nation state, for the time being is a locus of power. We want to kind of remake it as much as possible, but with an internationalist project in mind, but the tension is there.
Can I put you on the spot and ask you to pick four? Because I want to make sure that I'm not missing folks. I don't know who had their hand raised first. So at least it's and you're responsible rather than me.
And had their hand up for a long time, particularly Brian and John.
And then maybe we have
So somebody in the back here,
yeah.
some of the back row, all right, so.
And then maybe we can do one more.
All right, so this is maybe a selfish question, so I'll keep it really brief, but it's to ask you to reflect a bit more on historical practice, because I was actually really surprised, I think, by your answer, which was almost, it reminded me, Bob Gordon once talked about a mode of historical practice that was essentially like, if you had come up with if your opponents come up with a big sci-fi monster, what you do is you go back and you resurrect the hero that once slew the monster. And try to put it forward in the historical imagination today. And it struck me that both of you were endorsing a kind of counter-creedal.
No. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but just.
So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you reflect on a little more on what you think sort of the historical practice you're both engaged in.
You mentioned majorities numerous times in your remarks. I guess I was hoping you might clarify the reasons that majorities interest you, because you might be interested in majorities, like building a transformative or multiracial sort of majority coalition for like moral legitimacy reason, right? So to the extent that we're going to reach norms, we want that reach to have moral legitimacy, and so the majority would be like proxy for some sort of, give it some sort of democratic legitimacy. Another though would be just in terms of like practical efficacy, and I think there you could break that into two parts. One would be like electoral. Right, so earlier you talked about earlier socialists wanting to build majorities, which would in that sense meant to translate into legislative victories, or alternatively, the sort of majorities necessary to successfully effectuate a sort of breach or rupture, right, through let's say extra legal means. And the reason I ask is I think it might matter because I think in part like the pessimism that I think you expressed about building majorities is maybe a reflection of the sort of excessive outside focus on electoral majorities. Right, but in particular, if you think of like the age skew, right, because obviously our electoral process is sort of, for all kinds of reasons, sort of gives sort of outsized privilege to older voters who are ideologically sort of, broadly speaking, misaligned versus younger voters. Also, I know that you care a lot about like non-citizens, right? So in that sense, like the denominator from which we might sort of accept whether or not it's possible to build a majority, at least in the medium term, we might be more optimistic.
So on the internationalism point, in the mid 2000s, for instance, in Latin America, there was a lot of new constitutions and discussion about new constitutions. And I remember a lot of the talking points were like, you in the US, you have one old constitution and it's just sitting there, and we feel like every generation needs to be a part of writing a new constitution because it in and of itself is a power building exercise. So I'm curious about that. And then on the other question was about, so like, is there a wrong way to do this project? In the sense that, for instance, you were talking about the Dodge Revolutionary Movement in Detroit, and I think they were behind electing a Marxist judge, Stetson Rabbits in 60, 70, something like that. So they were actually, again, if I'm getting this right, then they were seeing the judiciary potentially, at least in that instance, potential tool. So I guess it's getting to this larger question of, is there a wrong way? Is there a wrong approach to doing this? And could you be making mistakes by doing something?
My question actually fits well with that one. I guess, the conversation is having a very high level and I'm really impressed by it. And I think I want to ask more about those internationalist dimensions. Like Aziz, you talked a little bit about the Chilean constitutional reform process. Willy talked about Mexico and Weimar. And I'm just sort of wondering in the back of my mind, like what the implications are of these kind of historical reflections for thinking about socialist constitutionalism. And maybe also, there's a much larger story in the 20th century of writing constitutions in post-revolutionary societies. Like the Soviet Union had so many constitutions, African socialist states wrote constitutions. And it seems to me like there's probably, to be an American and to be an internationalist would mean one part of that would mean looking to those other histories for things that are worth drawing on, right? Like what are the legacies of that 20th century internationalist socialist constitutionalist project in all these other countries that we can learn from. But then my fear, and I wondered why this didn't come up, is that it feels like those constitutional efforts didn't really protect the populations in those countries. That is to say that in most of these cases, socialist constitutions turned out to be like pieces of paper that didn't really protect populations or generate like a very democratic or other, form of government. Like, for example, in the Soviet Union, having had this whole history of rewriting and rewriting constitutions, but certainly not being a living democratic state. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Sure. Actually, that last, what's your name?
Aaron.
Aaron. So Aaron's question and Ryan's dovetails for me, and I'll use it. I mean, there's a lot more to say, but I'll use it to make one point, namely that my own politics is I basically think of myself, culturally and politically as a kind of third world internationalist. But I think, understanding yourself as part of a political tradition requires confronting the weaknesses and failures of that tradition. And, one of the significant failures, and you can think about this in the context of, for instance, like the Panthers domestically, but many of the first generation of independence movements, was precisely like what happens when you do not actually have majority support for some of your own ambitions and projects. And so like the Panthers, if you go and read the constitution that they came up with, it's it's a set of working papers from 1970, but it's just like an incredible document of what you could imagine a decolonized and transformed America to look like. It had no support. And the fact that it didn't have support created a basic tension, which is if you have no way of getting from here to there, then you're almost inevitably going to start thinking about using means that are violent or coercive as the condition for making the change that you want. So it presses for the move to armed struggle. It produces precisely the Cold War criticism of socialist internationalism, as well as anti-colonial movements, that at the end of the day, democracy is just a kind of instrument, and that there's a real profound critique of, of rights commitments that liberals made. And so to me, the reason why along with the efficacy point, but the reason why I actually think that majority building and power building has to be so key is because it's an effort to think seriously about the lessons learned from the very forces that one's been committed to. Robeson said the 1923 Soviet Constitution was the most egalitarian one he'd read. And, if you honestly, if you read the racial provisions, they're pretty incredible. But in practice, it was framed through a politics that essentially was deeply oppressive. And that is something that is also part of the legacy. It's been overstated by the Cold War liberal perspective, but it's there that has to be addressed. On history, so I'm not a trained historian. My background is in political theory, and over time, my writing has become increasingly more historical. And the reason why I'm interested in writing about history, and it's tied to these questions of memory, is because I think it is essential for actually being able to understand what in fact is possible in the present. Because history and historical analysis to me has been the only ground that I've been able to find to actually make sense of what are the deep underlying structures in the society? How do ideas and institutions fit together to create durable regime types? And then what have been the kind of moments of potential break or rupture? Who have been the people that have articulated it? What have been those political struggles? Where can you see agency in the context of this structure? And when I go back to thinking about these figures, it's very much not to be like, even though it might have sounded like this, Debs versus FDR, but rather to think about what David Scott's called the problem space, the problem space of earlier activists and the specific predicaments they faced in trying to marshal agency out of the reality of structure. And so that's the value of historical analysis. And then on judges, I think it is a wrong move to say because because juristocracy is bad and because the constitutional system is broken, we should essentially ignore the courts as a site of struggle. Like the courts, judges are state actors that impose violence every day on people. And if you just ignore it, you're essentially giving up grounds of political battle. Folks like, IWW activists engaged in extensive court struggles, despite the fact that they also thought that the state was fundamentally illegitimate. You can hold these things in common. And I sometimes worry that a position that's emerging on the left is to take the critique to then say abandoning the fear.
Okay, so as so often is true, although we're often sort of pitted against one another, we actually, Aziz and I are so often on the same page and have been for such a long time. So second, what Aziz said, I would sort of put it even more strongly, although telegraphically, that part of the tragedy of so much of socialism is the rejection of liberalism, is the idea, and by that I mean also sort of rule of law ideas, the idea of plurality of parties, the idea of a formal political arena, the sort of variations on a vanguard or one party scheme, so that it's that the project at this level in constitutional theory is sort of a liberal, democratic, progressive, socialist force. None of these is sort of dispensable, and too many of the constitutions you just referred, whatever their nominal commitments, are sort of interpreted, applied, or cast aside by those who just thought that politics is, and a separate realm of polity. However much you want to extend democracy elsewhere, the idea of dispensing with parties, elections, and some form of legislative practice is a fucking calamity. And much of socialist practice has sort of gone down that path. And then on historical practice, what to look at just the sort of my different historic, I've worn different kinds of historian's hats, and I think that the project, the anti-oligarchy constitution project was one that tried to straddle a sort of interpreting and reconstructing a tradition, looking, in the archives, in the records for when political economy was an object of constitutional politics on part of all sides, and being as interested in the way that Fishkin and I worked, and I did most of the historical stuff, worked through all the rival accounts. So it wasn't like, let's just find our friends, or let's find those particular political, economic, constitutional thinkers with whom we can sway neoliberalism, but let's look at the whole spectrum of these debates and how they engage with one another and dialectically shape one another. So very different from what Aziz is describing, more of a kind of situated critic engaged with this and trying to be a critic as well as just situated in carrying on that, but seeing it as a tradition that excavating that tradition. And with an eye toward its flaws, but also and that it's not that it did have this interpreter, right? That we are interpreting this as an exercise in constitutional theory. And I'll stop there.
So our apologies for going long. Our apologies for not getting to more of the questions. Thanks so much to